End of the day, we have Phil Haack from GitHub. I think you've heard of him before. If not, you should pay close attention to what he says, because I have never heard Phil say something I did not agree with. So there you go.
How do I do presenter mode? The Alt-Shift F5?
That's an excellent question.
Oh, there we go. All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm talking about social coding. You can get this in the shop.github.com. So this talk is a little different from the ones I normally give. Rather than talk about GitHub, like the Octocat I used in the title was just because I like the Octocat, but this talk is not actually about GitHub. I want to talk a little bit about how to create a better open source community. And when I say open source, I don't mean just .NET open source. I actually think, in my time at GitHub, I actually think the .NET open source community is quite good compared to some of the other ones I've witnessed. But I think we also need to integrate ourselves into the overall open source community and think about what that means. So, my name's Phil Haack. I'm on Twitter, and I have a blog. And this is my first computer. This is a TRS-80. I got this when I was about maybe 5 or 6. As you can see, I was pretty mature for my age. And I just love computers. I mean, obviously, we all know computers are transformative. But I think the part that's sometimes hard to see is that, I still believe we're at the very nascent part of computing, and that things are going to become even more amazing. Mark Andreessen says software is eating the world. Every company is going to be a software company. And so what that means to me is that defining how the community is going to be now is really important. So how many of you have read Peopleware? Okay. It's a fantastic book. So if I'm speaking really fast, I've been told to cut my talk by 5 minutes, and I don't want to remove anything, so I'm just going to talk really, really fast. So, okay. So I'm a manager at GitHub now, and I know, GitHub used to be this hipster company that had no managers, but we're so hipster that when everyone else started doing that, we decided to add managers back. And so I think a lot about people issues. I think the central thesis of Peopleware is that the major problems of our work are not technological, but they're sociological. Projects aren't late because you didn't JavaScript hard enough. They're late because of communication issues or misunderstanding of requirements. Oh, those measurements were metric. Well, we're using imperial. Oops, and then boom goes the spaceship, right? So there's a lot to admire about the open source software. I mean, I've been involved in open source for a long time now, probably since I think 2005, and I just love it. I think there's so much to admire. And so this talk about how to make it better isn't about saying, oh, we suck, we're not doing enough. No, it's more about, as a manager, I've been thinking a lot more about these social issues and these sociological issues. And I've learned a lot of things that I've been getting in my research as well as my training that I'm excited to share, because it's kind of like when you learn a new framework or a new technique and you're like, wow, this is going to make my code better. If you saw Amy's talk, she talks about removing state and mutations. You think, oh, if I apply that, my software is going to be better. And so a lot of these stuff I'm going to talk about is about how we make our community better. And so there's a lot to admire about open source. I really like the focus on ideas and transparency and equality. It's a lot of things that we wish our governments would do. So, for example, imagine if changes to the legal code of every country was done on GitHub. This is an example of a diff of the French legal code that goes back all the way to the time of Napoleon. And this is not done by the French government. It's just done by some individual. But you can see that this is a really neat way of seeing how laws change over time. And would love to see the legal code actually change through pull requests. So make that happen, Obama. But there are very real social problems that we need to look at and address and figure out if there are ways that we can improve. So there's according to the Department of Labor, 26% of computing jobs are done by women, which who knows if that's actually accurate. But when you look in this crowd, we can see that. But according to a FLOSS 2013 survey, only 11% of contributors to open source are women. And so that disparity is it's pretty sharp, right? And, I was curious about, so that's about women, but I was curious about, racial makeup of the open source community. And I couldn't find really good data. So I feel like there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this space. So clearly we can only assume that women just aren't interested or predisposed to programming open source, right? That women are not altruistic as men, right? So I tend to think that's that is a hypothesis, but I think it's intellectually lazy to latch onto that and assume that that's the only possible explanation of this. In fact, there was this really interesting study that was focused on race, but I think it would apply to gender as well, that said essentialist thinking. And what that means is that you think like a race and attitudes and what is the word I'm thinking of? Oh, that racial differences are associated with ability and personality traits, right? And that this is the essential part of being a woman or being a member of a minority group. That those folks did more statistically significantly more poorly on creativity tests than those who didn't hold to essentialist views. And if you think about it, it makes total sense, right? Like if you can't think out of the box and realize that your preconceptions might not be right, then you're maybe not a creative person. If you think that this is the only way that programmers look like, right? So I was thinking about why is there this disparity? Is it that we're sending messages that women don't belong in this community? I feel like this community, even though if you look out there, there's we reflect the general community. I feel like this community is very welcoming to that. And what's interesting to me is that it wasn't always like this. So this is Ada Lovelace. She's the first programmer. So for a brief shining moment in history, 100% of programmers were women. This is Admiral Grace Hopper. She wrote the first compiler. This is Margaret Hamilton. She was a lead engineer who developed the onboard flight software for the Apollo space program. And that's a printout of the program listing. So I'm glad we don't program. And I'm glad we have GitHub now. And here's an example of, this is a photo from Life magazine of IBM programmers at work. And, back at this time, programming was considered women's work. Men did real work, like hardware, rah, and women did programming. But then there was a shift, a change happened, and women were actually pushed out of the industry and pushed out of computer science in colleges. And it was a gradual, subtle change. It wasn't like some, cabal of men said, hey, we want those jobs, we're going to push them out. But it was a subtle societal change. So a friend of mine wrote this tweet 3 years ago, and it was really interesting because she, a lot of people say, oh, women aren't interested. She was a big open source proponent. She was really into it. But just recently, 3 years later, she writes this. For what it's worth, I also don't give a shit about the open source community anymore because it doesn't give a shit about me. So I feel like there's this sense where she's like, this isn't, indifference, this is a change, right? And then she gets, gets people being kind of rude to her. I think this happens more to women developers than men developers. I think that's actually well documented on Twitter, for example, that men are more likely to contradict a woman than they are another man. And in part, I think it's the cognitive dissonance I mentioned before, right? When we have this image of what a programmer is and someone doesn't fit that image, that we tend to, there's this tendency, I'm not saying we as in you, but there's this tendency to rebel against that. And, even Amy, who spoke earlier, who I think we could all agree is a very clearly a competent developer, has experienced this sort of thing. So I feel like that there's this tendency that there's these attitudes that creates an environment that isn't attractive for people who are new to open source, regardless of race or gender. But I think disproportionately affects women, minorities, and others. And it's interesting because sometimes there's this almost glorification of this behavior, right? We have these heroes in the open source community who we're like, yeah, they don't give a fuck. They'll just say what they mean, and that's awesome. But at the time, they're alienating people who are trying to get into this community. So why do and so this is an interesting observation by Ash Dryden, that a lot of times, part of the problem, the other aspect of the problem isn't just the environment. Okay, 5 minutes. So I better go faster. It isn't just the environment, it's the fact that, there's not as much opportunities for people to work on it. People don't have time for unpaid labor. So why do we care? I mean, hopefully it's because we're decent people, we have empathy, and we value fairness and equality. And, being not caring is kind of a privilege. It's something that, if you don't have empathy, maybe you wouldn't care. But hopefully we have empathy and we do care. But, just in case empathy isn't a strong argument, I actually have some ROI arguments. There's really interesting studies and research in this space. For example, diversity is a competitive advantage. And I know Kathleen Dollard in her talk Sunday night touched upon some of the same studies I did. But companies with higher proportions of women board directors outperform others by 53%. More specifically, the companies with the most women board of directors outperform the ones with the least in 3 different areas: return on equity, return on sales, and return on invested capital. So it's a competitive advantage. Your company will do better. Your open source project will do better. Complex decision making improves when you have diversity. I really like this one. It's not just that people who have diverse viewpoints introduce new ideas, but that the existing people in the group also feel freer to express different viewpoints, right? We know that there's sort of this mold of the developer, right? You love bacon, we're really into cats and memes and animated GIFs, right? And there's nothing wrong with bacon. I love bacon too, but this idea that when you have a heterogeneous group, people will feel more free to break the mold and say different ideas. And again, that's documented study, double-blind studies. So what can we do? We need to be aware of unconscious bias. So there's this really great video by Google HR. They're taking a real data-driven approach to all this. And I highly recommend it. I'll have a link up about unconscious bias, how it affects it. The important thing is, I'll give an easy example, right? In the U.S. population, 14.5% of all men are 6 feet and over, but in Fortune 500 companies, that's 58% of CEOs are 6 feet and over. So would you say that height is correlated to being a successful CEO? Or have we our biases associate certain traits with height? In fact, a lot of studies show that most CEOs exhibit sociological traits and that those don't actually correspond to high performance, but we still keep pushing them up. So this is a lot of words here, but I want to really I'll summarize this. This is an amazing study. Kathleen mentioned this as well. Double-blind study for students applying for a lab manager position. Same exact resume. The names were randomly selected, male or female, sent to a bunch of research institutions. The male candidates were given more offers at higher rates and offered more mentorship. Here's the kicker. The gender of the faculty participants did not affect responses, such as female and male faculty both exhibited the same bias. In other words, women are just as biased as women against women as men are. So men were not the only assholes around here. So it's great. But the point of this is that these are implicit, unconscious biases. We all have them. You have them. I have them. And it's really easy to say, well, I'm not biased against anyone. But this is the culture we live in, the society, the way we've been raised, that we don't even know we have them. And there's a whole set of implicit bias tests you can take. So don't feel blamed. I'm not trying to shame anyone. That's not my style. What I'd rather do is make you aware of it, and then we could start thinking about ways to address it and improve it. And so, for example, at my company, we're trying to do structured hiring now. So, there's the study about the violinists. When they do blind auditions, it raised the rate of women being hired. We can't do blind auditions, but there's other techniques we can do to improve the fairness of our hiring practices. And so we've been doing a lot based on the research that Google has done and other research. We can hold each other accountable. A lot of times, like we had this internal discussion at GitHub about microaggressions, like men cutting women off or, interrupting each other. And it's really interesting because a natural response is, hey, if I ever do that, please tell me. Don't let me off the hook. But like, I don't want to hold the people that I'm aggressing accountable to letting me know I'm being a jerk. So instead I'll speak to the other men in here, like, you hold me accountable, I'll hold you accountable, I'll hold myself accountable. The other big thing is promote work time open source contribution. If we can get, there's this whole idea that GitHub is your resume, and I think it's beautiful because I work at GitHub, but there's a sinister part of that, which is, well, if marginalized people are disproportionately not in open source, then that's actually hurting their chances in the work market, right? So what can we do? Well, it's hard to fix that, but if you're a manager, if you work at a company, try to convince your company to allow people to work on open source and build up their open source resume on work time. Promote to causes like there's a bunch of programs that help: Google Summer of Code, Black Girls Code, Rails Goal, Summer of Code, Code 2014. Really great organizations. This whole next section is about sort of how to be better maintainers, but I think I'll skip that because I'm running out of time. I just like people need. I'll do it real quick. So people new to open source find it intimidating, and this Michael Meeks had this really amazing analogy. These are my kids, and when you need to review new contributions like a child's drawing, right? So if your child did this, you wouldn't respond like this, right? Like D and Daddy looks like a B. Wait, is that me? No, you'd respond like this. Wow, thank you so much. I particularly like this. Hey, I pushed it with a few minor corrections, the master. And thanks again. Looking forward to your next piece. So as you leave this talk and this conference, I hope you take away a few things. The open source community is an inspiration, but could be an even more positive force for change. And we can be a part of that. You, me, everybody, we're part of the problem, but we're also part of the solution. And we can actually change society. I mean, we've already done it with open source. Open source has already changed society. It's already changed how companies work. So the idea that, this is the way it is, we can't change society is, I think, already been proven wrong. And so we have the power to make it better. So go forth, be awesome, and let's make this a great community to be a part of. Thank you. So send out, hopefully I'll send out, I have a lot of interesting links. And one other thing, I ran out of the Women Coder sticker, so I apologize if you didn't get one. But the true fact, the official name of the Octocat is Mona Lisa Octocat. So every Octocat sticker is actually a woman, so there you go.